Welcome to this Climate Chat Club interview with climate scientist Kevin Anderson. I'm your host, Dan Miller. This interview was recorded on May 13th, 2021. I want to say a special thank you to Albert Bates for help with the recording. This interview is part of a series of interviews with climate scientists, authors, advocates, communicators, and others involved in understanding and fighting climate change. It is sponsored by the Climate Chat Club on the social platform Clubhouse. If you're a member of Clubhouse, please join our club. Note that the audio quality is limited in this recording. Future interviews will feature improved audio quality. And now, my interview with climate scientist Kevin Anderson. Kevin, first of all, again, welcome. I just tell everyone I've been following Kevin for at least 10 years, and he's been one of my go-to climate scientists because of the fact that I've always appreciated that he tells it like it is. And I think when you have a big problem like climate change in front of you, you have to, be sober and look at what the problem really is, or else you can't solve it. And he's been doing that for a long time. Sometimes, I guess, annoying people at the time of doing it, other climate scientists. But anyway, so we're going to get into a really interesting discussion today. But I just want to start off because Kevin actually has a very interesting background. So, Kevin, can you just give us a little bit of your background and how you came to be a climate scientist? Okay.
Yeah.
Leave it at that.
Well, if I try and keep it quite quick then. Well, actually, I left school at 16 and went to work in the engine rooms of ships doing my engineering apprenticeship, working on big diesel and steam turbine engines in tankers and container ships, and indeed one passenger liner. And then later on in life, I went to university. I did an engineering degree, and then during my degree, I was deciding what to do after that. And I went to work for a fairly large American oil company, and I was designing and building offshore oil platforms. And then I went offshore and worked offshore in a hookup and commissioning for 2 platforms. And so that was my sort of engineering background. But right from being a child, I was always interested in environmental issues. There wasn't, climate change wasn't one of those in the late 60s and through the 70s. It really came to the fore sort of more in the latter part of the 80s. And when it did come to the fore, I was quite interested in that because I was involved in the oil industry. So I decided to do a little bit more research into that. And then as a consequence of sort of thinking about it more, went back to university, did a master's course in environmental issues, and then on to do a PhD looking specifically at the electricity industry and climate change. So that was the sort of the shift from engineering and oil and so forth over to working in universities. So unconventional for most academics, I think. Quite a succinct summary, but you're welcome to ask me any more about that. But that's really how I transferred from originally engineering into working in the climate realm.
And can you tell us just briefly what your current positions are? Because I've always known you as the director of the Tyndall Center, but that was a long time ago.
That was some time ago now. I'm still in the Tyndall Center. I'm a professor of energy and climate change at the University of Manchester. But I also work at the University of Uppsala in Sweden and the University of Bergen in Norway. So I have the sort of 3 positions as Professor of Energy and Climate Change. And before anyone starts to pick me up on this, I don't spend a lot of time traveling between them. So I do a lot of virtual engagement, and I go over to Scandinavia periodically by train, and then usually spend quite a few months there, and then come back to the UK after that. So it's sort of long stints that I spend at these other universities.
Yeah, people might not know that about you, that you do not fly at all. And it's been a very long time that you've done that.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I always say I don't really have a no-fly policy, but I haven't flown for work since 2002. And for personal reasons, I flew in 2004, but I haven't flown since then. And I think it's quite possible to run an academic career.
You went to a conference in China and you took the train there, and it took you a couple of weeks to get there. Is that right?
Oh, I did. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, when I was director of the Tyndall Center, and there's sort of various sort of protocols because we were setting up a new center at the University of Fudan in China, and they wanted, almost like expected, the director of the Tyndall Center to be there for this event. And because I wasn't flying, I thought I had to go by train. But it was interesting because it brings out all the challenges of trying to reorganize your life. It wasn't easy just to be like, I couldn't just get up and go. There's a lot of issues about visas. There's no sort of structure there to allow you to do that sort of thing. And also it meant that, unlike most of my colleagues that flew there for one day and did the usual sort of banal 20-minute talk and went to the Chinese circus in the evening and then flew home the following day, I mean, I wasn't going to do that because it took me 11 days to get there. So I went on a 3-week lecture tour in China, knowing that I wouldn't be back in China for many, many more years. So it just fundamentally changes your behavior. You have to do things differently. You have no choice if you're going to travel slowly.
Oh, that's great. By the way, the climate science is a very broad field. Can you just tell us the area of climate science that you focus on?
Well, I focus principally on mitigation, on reducing our emissions, and in that area on the emissions, particularly from energy. So I'm interested in the other issues and the other gases coming from, say, process emissions from industry or from agriculture and food and from deforestation. And then obviously I do engage a lot with the sort of climate science community, trying to understand what the climate science tells us about what it is that we need to think about in terms of reducing our emissions. But I think it's a very important distinction between, if you like, the science, which is, I mean, there isn't such a thing as climate science. It's just science. I mean, I almost don't like the language of climate science. It's just physics and chemistry and biology. There's nothing special that's been invented for the climate. It uses the standard rules of physics that tell us how mobile phones work or how the planes stay in the air. The same rules of physics that we apply in terms of science. But I focus more on the mitigation side, on reducing our emissions, which is where you start to blend science, engineering, technology, social sciences, politics, economics, and philosophy as well. So all those other elements are embedded in mitigation.
That's a great comment. I actually hadn't heard that before. But it's true, of course. Hey, so now we're going to kind of get into it. But on the way into it, I want to ask you sort of a very basic question. There's a lot of discussion about the 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius warming limits or backstops or whatever you want to call them. And can you talk about whether those are scientifically derived numbers or something else?
Well, they're informed by science, but science can't tell you what's dangerous. I mean, scientists might have a view as citizens as to what is dangerous or what is not dangerous, but science can't tell you that. That's a much more sort of contextual, sort of value-driven judgment. Mm-hmm. And so science has informed the global debate on these issues, and it looks at things like particularly to do with impact. So even these 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, we have to remember they're just proxies. I mean, who cares about 2 degrees centigrade if change in temperature if it occurs over a million years? It doesn't matter. What matters is the rate of change of impacts, and can we as human systems, can ecosystems, can they evolve in a reasonable sort of fashion with the rate of change of impacts that are being imposed upon us by climate change, by the warming? And temperature is it's an okay proxy for that. So we're looking at temperature change over quite short periods of time, 50 to 100 years really, and then we're sort of saying that's a good enough proxy for impacts, and the science tells us what those impacts would look like. It gives us an approximate feel of those impacts for 1.5 and 2 degrees, and indeed for higher temperatures as well. And then it's the role of the sort of messy process of international negotiations to come up with what is deemed to be an acceptable level of climate change that we can now stay below. And that process has come up with 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. But that science has only informed that debate. It doesn't tell us they're the appropriate thresholds. And I think science would probably tell us that the impacts we're likely to see are going to be very severe, even below 1.5. Right. And if you like, our other elements that empirical data we have shows us that actually people are already suffering and dying from the 1 degree centigrade of warming that we've already imposed upon the global system. So the science informs that debate, but it cannot tell us what is dangerous or what is the appropriate threshold to aim for.
Yeah, I think right. That is. There's a lot of discussion. Everyone thinks that if we hit 1.5, everything's going to be rosy or something like that.
Well, if you're wealthy living in Boulder, Colorado, you might be fine at 1.5, at least depending on what other global impacts there are. But certainly if you're in some of the more vulnerable parts of the world, I mean, they're going to be severely impacted. It's livelihoods that will be lost and destroyed at those sorts of temperatures.
But okay, well let's dig in on that. So the Paris Accord sets this goal of no more than 2 degrees and hopefully below 1.5. I forget the exact wording, but it does set that. And recently there's been lots of climate scientists actually and others saying, hey, we have all the tools we need to get to where we need to go. We can get net zero with renewable energy only, without any negative emissions and things like that. And so where are we? What do we have to do to hit the 1.5? And is the Paris Accord being reasonable about that? Is there anything like hidden in there that we should know? Some assumptions they're making when they talk about being possible to reach these numbers that are not obvious?
Well, I mean, the Paris Accord sets up this global commitment that we've got to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally pursue 1.5, no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, which, as I said before, are already very dangerous thresholds for many people around the world. And it doesn't tell us directly how we can do that. It does use various forms of language, because the Paris Agreement, remember, it's informed by science, but it's much more informed by Boeing 747s of lawyers that turn up from the wealthy countries of the world. So so that's the reason you have whole debates over shall and should and all this other language in the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, of course, is hugely influenced by the selfish attitude of individual states, and particularly then, of course, by the welfare of the individual states. So I mean, it's still quite an impressive document that actually, out of that process of self-interest, actually has emerged something that actually I think is useful, but with some real drawbacks within it. So it then talks about the sort of levels of emissions that need to be achieved at certain times during the century, particularly 2030 and 2050. But in doing that, it's sort of hiding the fact that it's relying on huge amounts of what are often referred to as negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal. Basically, some way that we can remove carbon dioxide. I'm going to say we. Of course, I don't really mean we. I mean our children and our children's children. So we're already passing that burden to another generation. Can remove huge quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the future. And that allows us to actually sort of paint a relatively politically palatable picture for the nearer term. So that was sort of embedded within the language and some of the very few numbers that are actually in the Paris Agreement. And I think that part is highly misleading. But because it's there to maintain that sort of political momentum that people will buy into it because it doesn't look too challenging. But actually, if you played out the temperature thresholds themselves, and we're not to rely on these huge, or we're not to rely rather on our children deploying these huge numbers of technology in the future, then the political challenge is an order of magnitude different to what most people would interpret from the Paris Agreement.
Well, okay. Let's get into that. So let's put carbon. We're going to get into carbon capture a little bit later, but let's just put that aside and say we're going to follow what some of these other scientists like Mark Jacobson and Michael Mann say, that we have all the tools in our toolbox that we need right now. And by the way, I certainly agree we have all the tools we need to get started. That's absolutely true. And I do think we're going to get to net zero, or we can get to net zero completely on renewables. So let's just focus on that path. We're going to get to, as fast as we can, get to net zero using renewables. How fast do we have to do that to stay under 1.5 degrees without using carbon capture later to lower things?
Well, I think the first thing to recognise when we use this language of net zero, which I don't particularly like, it's a new language, a relatively new language. If you look at reports 5 years ago, you would hardly ever use that language, ever see it. So it's suddenly emerged, and everyone loves it because you can hide anything under net zero.
Okay.
But if we are to use net zero, and I think as a headline scientific framing, of course, it's broadly right. And it's broadly right because we cannot eliminate all of the greenhouse gases from agriculture. There will always be some nitrous oxide, N2O emissions, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, and some methane emissions. Even if the whole world went vegan and we didn't eat any rice, we would still have fairly high levels of emissions from agriculture, just from the process of growing things. And so you have to pay, if you're going to try and feed 9 billion people, you've got to find some way to compensate from that warming, from that ongoing methane, and particularly the ongoing N2O emissions. From fertilizer use, and that's even true of organic fertilizers. It doesn't really matter which sort of fertilizer. So you're going to get ongoing warming, and for that part you require some compensation. And the double speak that's been going on for a long time now, since this net zero came along, is we then talk about net zero in relation to, as you just did actually, renewable power and energy. In terms of energy, we have to get to real zero. In other words, no emissions of CO2. And whatever compensation we need is going to have to compensate the warming from the non-CO2 greenhouse gas, CO2 greenhouse gases such as N2O and methane. And so we must remember we're going to real zero for energy. And if we want real zero for energy at 1.5, if we want a good chance of 1.5, if you draw a straight line from today, the globe would have to stop emitting any CO2 by about 2029. If you took the headline number for a good chance of staying below 1.5 from IPCC SR 1.5 and the latest big report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then if you want to stay within that carbon budget, you'd have to draw a straight line pretty much from the beginning of, I think it's 2022, but it might be in 2021 now, to 2029, and that will just keep you within the budget. Now, as you get a lower challenge...
Does that include, by the way, I don't know if you've thought about this, but does that include all of the emissions that are going to come from building the vast amount of renewable energy, like all the wind turbines and the solar panels and all that? Does it include... It does include emissions from that, but has anyone calculated what that would be? That would just blow the budget on its own.
It might do, but I think there's an interesting question there, and it's a question that occasionally I get asked, and more and more so by some people, and it's a really important question, but I think it partly misunderstands the challenge that we face. It thinks the challenge that we face is additional to running the world as it is today. So in addition to driving everywhere and owning cars and owning big houses and aspiring to consuming more and more stuff that many of us do, we're going to do this thing about moving to renewables. If you put those two together, it blows the budget. It makes no sense. But if we have a fundamental shift in the productive capacity of our society, like we did during I don't particularly like war metaphors, but unfortunately we lack any sort of historical precedents for what we're facing today. So if you think about what we did in continental Europe during 1939, hopefully this will be more productive in this case and constructive. But what we did in 1939, if you look at the Marshall Plan after war and the reconstruction of Europe, if you look at the Roosevelt's Green New Deal, these give a flavour of the complete shift in the productive capacity of society. So it's a bit like, Roosevelt's sort of comment about going into the car company saying, we want you to build some tanks. And they say, well, we can't build tanks, we're building cars. And Roosevelt turns around and says, well, actually, you don't understand. You won't be building cars. And that's the shift we're talking about. If we are serious about staying within our commitments, and I don't think we are, but if we are serious about our commitments, I think they're just vague promises, basically, with lots of rhetoric around them. But if we are serious about our commitments, then we have to have a fundamental shift in what our society chooses to do, where it puts its resources. And then, if that's the case, you don't necessarily see a massive increase in the amount of emissions, because what you're doing is you're no longer building very, very large houses. You're no longer building hugely ridiculous cars. You're now moving the resources from that into the shift in society, the physical infrastructure and the renewables and all the grids and all those other huge challenges. You're putting the money into those things. So it's a different world that we live in terms of what we do with our labour and our resources. But unfortunately, because that's politically unacceptable, we massage this at every possible occasion to make it look like a jolly addition to business as usual. Well, fine, if we started in 1990, we've chosen, us high emitters particularly, have chosen to squander the intervening 3 decades, and we're now facing the music of a cumulative problem. It's not the same problem it was in 1990 or 2000 or 2010. 2021 is a harder problem than it was in 2020, which was a harder problem than it was in 2019. It gets harder and harder because it's a cumulative problem.
Right. We waited a long time. Well,
worse than waited. We
doubled emissions since. Since Jim Hansen spoke to Congress and said we had to do something about it. We went on and doubled our emissions since then. Let's stay on this just for a moment. And so going from where we are now to true zero emissions in 2029. First of all, do you think that's even theoretically possible? Let's start with theoretically possible. I mean, theoretically in a not a scientific way, but just if you were king of the world, and you could direct everybody to do its World War II footing, do you think that's even possible?
I think probably. I don't really. No, I think all of climate change pushes our imagination to the absolute extremes. So the one thing I would say is that there are no non-radical futures. The future is radically different to the present, either because we make huge, rapid shifts in reducing our emissions with profound shifts in our society, or we hang on to the status quo for a few more years whilst we lock in huge shifts from the impacts of climate change. So the future is radically different. There's no neat way around that. We squandered that neat way by carrying on emitting. So we've just faced
That's a great way. That's a great way to think about it, actually.
So the future is radically different from the present, one way or the other. One can be more controlled, in other words, we can reduce our emissions, or the other one, you just wait for the ad hoc, random, and reckless impacts of climate change that we will have put into the system, a huge additional energy we'll have put into the atmosphere. But do I think we can do it by 2029? I mean, the problem is we have almost no one producing scenarios or looking at whether that's in any way feasible, because we can't possibly contemplate it because it's going to be politically too challenging. So.
We're going to get to carbon capture a little later. I know you have.
I don't think I can't see of a way we could do it by 2029. This is why for a long time I think you could hold to 2 degrees centigrade of warming, which is deeply depressing, because that's huge levels of impacts. But I don't think you can deliver. This is my judgment, and I'm happy to be proved wrong on this. Very happy to be proved wrong on it. I don't think you can deliver 1.5 degrees centigrade by just reducing emissions. But I think you can just
which we're not doing anyway, by the way.
Which we're not doing. We've increased the amount of rhetoric hugely, but we haven't increased our actual action. So rhetoric has gone up. If rhetoric could be translated into mitigation, then we'd be doing really well. But unfortunately, it can't.
Well, hopefully, rhetoric is a precursor. By the way, actually,
30-year precursor.
But yeah, by the way, I didn't have this question written down, but let me ask you this one. I've been following you for a long time, like at least a decade, and I've learned a lot. But I also felt quite alone listening to you, along with a few other people following this issue. But the broader public was not. But I've noticed in the last 2 years, and especially even the last 6 months, there are discussions about things like carbon capture, for example, was something that I was pretty alone in talking about a while ago. And now it's like a main subject, and there's a lot of rhetoric. Are you noticing that maybe we're at some kind of tipping point on public engagement? Are you noticing that at all?
Public engagement more generally, or just on relation to CCS, carbon capture?
No, climate.
Oh, yeah. It's a deeply depressing area to work in, climate change. And there've been little high points. There was one in the UK where I have to say most of my focus is on UK, Europe, and the wealthy parts of the world. And we had one in the UK when we had the 2008 Climate Change Act, a piece of central primary government legislation, which actually had, I think, very high agreement. I think 4 MPs, 4 of our members of Parliament voted against it, and everyone else voted for it. I think it was the biggest majority in history of the UK Parliament, something like that. And it got through, and it's actually really interesting, and I think still probably world-leading piece of legislation. We haven't followed it up. This is Britain, so we don't follow those sort of things up. But it's a really good piece of legislation, and that particular time I felt there's a chance here that we could start to do something. This can be translated to other parts of the world and so forth. And then we squandered it all. We had the banking crisis, and we did all the usual sorts of, we ramped up the rhetoric and did very little about climate change, and the emissions just continued to rise. And then it's been pretty depressing area to work in climate change, really, ever since then. The Paris Agreement was a small sort of blip upwards. But the last 2 years, the last year particularly, I think there are some really interesting signs of things changing. Or at least they're the early signs of change. But they haven't come from the usual suspects. They haven't come from the great and good, and very seldom the great ideas come from the great and good. In fact, I always say I've never met a great and good person, or I've only ever met great and good people. But there are certain people who think they are in that category. But it hasn't come from the great and good. It hasn't come from the usual suspects. It hasn't come from academia. It hasn't particularly come from the formal NGOs either. It's actually come out of a sort of various or ragtag mixes of civil society. And so whether it's the youth groups or in the UK and Europe, much more this thing called Extinction Rebellion, which is a bit of a sort of slightly anarchic ad hoc mix of people, but also much wider groups in civil society talking about these issues. I think it's actually come out of that group, which is really surprising, because I would argue a lot of the time the challenges as they describe them is much more in line with what the pure science says is necessary if we're to deliver on the commitments that we've made in Paris, say 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, than actually is coming out of academia. So academia has just sort of massaged everything, fine-tuned its assumptions to keep things politically palatable. Quite a lot of the NGOs have done that, and of course the policymakers all love it. So there's a whole sort of deluded rhetorical little nonsense that goes on in the establishment, which isn't, I would argue, in line with the science. And then suddenly out pops this sort of messy, emergent civil society set of groups who are sort of banging on about things that actually is much more in line with what the numbers from the science suggest. And I think that gives me some sort of hope. And what I found even additionally interesting to this, and this is for North Americans and people in other parts of the world, that I can't say what's happening there, but within the UK and within Europe, what is interesting is that we're seeing lots of mayors and councils putting in place a target framework that is actually much more ambitious than our national governments are saying is necessary. And indeed much more ambitious than actually a lot of our senior co-opted academics are saying. And I find that really, really quite heartening. Now, again, it's all very well putting targets in place, but let's see the action. And the climate doesn't respond to targets. The climate only responds to less CO2 emissions and other GHGs. So it's not good enough, but it's a start to at least the debate is being had more locally and regionally that is aligned with the science, I think driven by the civil society groups, more than it is by the establishment, and in this establishment I'm including many of the more senior academics.
Wow. Hey,
so that's some hope. There's some hope there. If you like, there's some hope.
That's right, yeah. By the way, where I am in Berkeley, they actually were the first city to ban new natural gas hookups. So then that's starting to spread around, and a lot of things start at the local level can grow.
They certainly can,
Let's talk about 2 degrees, because we talked about 1.5, and going to get there, we'd have to get a ramp down to 0 by 2029. What's your thoughts on what's needed for 2C?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit happy with 2C because I spend a lot of my time looking at it in detail and have done for almost for 2 decades, because it's been sort of a framing in the UK and some of continental Europe for at least 2 decades now. And so we just had a paper out last year where we actually unpicked what would 2 degrees centigrade look like, well below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, we looked at this at a sort of global level, and we were focusing here on energy, so the focus here was on CO2, and particularly energy, which is where the lion's share of emissions come from, sort of 75% or so of the emissions and the warming. And I can tell you that for the wealthy parts of the world, we'd need to be somewhere around about 0 CO2 by about 2035. Now, that might be a little bit later for some of the poorer countries in the wealthy group. So if you're Poland or somewhere like that, it might take a bit longer. If you're Switzerland or Luxembourg or some of the wealthier parts, you'll be a bit earlier than that. So 2035 to 2040, at the very outside 2040. But that's only if you start now. And because it's a cumulative problem, every year we choose to fail, or every year our reduction rates aren't at the rate that is necessary, and the end date comes closer to us. So if we started in the wealthy parts of the world, to give some sort of, just the headline framing of this, we'd need roughly 10% reductions in emissions every single year starting from now. But given that it takes us 2 or 3 years to reach 10%, even if we're serious about it, which I say we're not, but even if we were, then because it's a cumulative problem, because our emissions are so high in the near term, the 2 or 3 years it might take to get to 10% actually then means you have to aim more like 20% by 2030 and get to 0 by 2035. So the sort of slight lag, the problem because we've left it so late, the lag in driving rapid reductions in our society means, because we're so high emissions now, that actually you squander most or a large part of the budget in the early years between now and say 2025. Because I think we all accept that only in a model can we go from what we're doing today to 10% reduction next year.
Well, we have another COVID.
But that was only 6 or 7%.
Right.
Even COVID delivered the reductions. You have a couple of COVIDs with all the tragedy that came with it, but that's the problem. It's a useful metaphor, but like most metaphors or analogies, it quickly falls apart because it was driven by things that. But it does show us that we can make rapid changes in our societies if they're necessary. But of course, it was set against a backdrop of deep tragedy for many people, and it was completely disorganised as well in many respects. But nevertheless, I think it gives us some indicator that when people tell us before, you can never do this, well, actually you can. If you're actually serious about it, you can do all sorts of things that the year before you didn't think were possible. So in that sense, there are lots of lessons to learn from it. But I think we must never use it. We must never use it superficially, because it was it is continuing to be a time of deep tragedy around the world for lots of people and lots of families.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the lessons we learned from COVID is that everything can be okay one day and then not okay the next day. Because I think there's a lot of optimism biased when it comes to climate change. Like, well, it's, this is the way it's always been. I can't imagine it being any different than that, And with COVID, you can learn, in just a few weeks, you can go, from things being okay to being very, very different. So I hope we're learning that lesson, but we'll see.
Hopefully we are. So I should have added one more bit about the 2 degrees centigrade, which I didn't add on before. The way we divided it out was in line with the Paris Agreement, which we're not saying we were in favour of one way or another, but the Paris Agreement, indeed every single international agreement going back to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, all awful acronyms the climate change community uses. But that goes back to 1992 and the big sort of Rio Earth Summit. Ever since then, we've also said that the wealthy parts of the world should lead in reducing their emissions. So there's this whole sort of equity dimension, and which is locked up in another terrible acronym, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which basically means the rich countries need to lead by example. So it's a terrible expression, CBDR. But it does actually, it's locked into the Paris Agreement as well. And so for the poorer parts of the world, there was about a 15-year lag for them to get to zero emissions. So wealthy parts of the world, zero emissions by about 2035. poorer parts of the world, zero emissions by about 2050. But they will still need to peak their emissions. The poor parts of the world will need to peak their emissions by about 2025. Now, no one is talking about that. China saying we might peak by 2030, India by 2050. So at the moment, that is still massively more challenging than most of the analysis for poorer parts of the world.
But okay, now let's stay on the Paris Accord. So we have these words up front that say we shouldn't go over 2 degrees and we shouldn't go over, try not to go over 1.5. And then they go into a thing where people get to voluntarily set their emissions reductions, the INDCs, and what the countries pledge to do. And my understanding, and please correct me or tell me what the real number is, forget the 1.5 and 2. The pledges lead us to about 3.7 degrees warming, or at least at one point it might be updated since then. So what's the difference between that?
Well, the first thing, you can't say exactly where the pledges lead us, even from the standard science. And the reason for that is because the actual pledge itself, then there are INDs, again, more terrible acronyms. There were INDCs before, intended nationally determined contributions, and they're now called NDCs. So countries are sort of wedded to their commitments now, nationally determined contributions, pledges, promises, wishes. So if you add them together, they're only required to cover the period out to 2030. So after 2030, they don't cover. Now, you can, if you wanted to, when you submitted from your country, you could submit your sort of provisional thoughts about what would happen after 2030, and some did and some didn't. Some of the NDCs are in absolute reductions in emissions. Other ones are in relative reductions compared to the economy, so carbon intensity. So they're really hard to tell what happens. If the economy does really well, then your emissions go up. If the economy doesn't do so well, the emissions go down, or don't go up as much. And so the NDC framework doesn't give you a really nice sort of neat total level of emissions. So you have to put a lot of assumptions on that. So depending on whether you want to be really, really optimistic, what happens after 2030, or sort of follow the standard trends, and very approximately, if you look at the NDCs, these pledges, it really means globally no reduction by about 2030. You could say it's a little bit up or a little bit down, but it's very approximately no reduction by 2030 if you add them together. Which is why they're supposed to be coming together this year to revamp their nationally determined contributions and saying, what are the newer ones, slightly tighter ones. But if you assume that there's an increased level of commitment after 2030, but not the dramatic levels that would be necessary, then I think it's fair to say that the NDCs are somewhere between 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming. So a different planet, in my view.
So you said something 10 years ago in your Going Beyond Dangerous lectures and things. About what does 4 degrees C mean? I actually have this memorized, but now I actually have you here. So can you please tell us, in your mind, what a world with 4 degrees warming, what does that mean?
Well, the reason I was interested in that at the time, because there was a lot of discussion about we won't hold to the 2 degrees centigrade and we're going to head up towards 3 or 4. But then I asked, it was a sort of an informal polling at the numerous events that I attended. So I'd asked people who worked in areas on impacts, on adaptation, on the climate science, or anyone who really worked in this realm, what their interpretation of this was. And almost, and I say almost, but I think it's probably fair to say without exception, people said, it just wasn't a viable future. I think the simplest summary is it's a different world. It's not the world we live in. Now again, if it occurred over 1 million years or 3,000 years, that'd be fine. But we're talking about, by the end of this century.
Oh, you cut out. Kevin, we can't hear you right now.
It's coming
Kevin?
through. You can't
there we go. Yeah. Now you're back now. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm back now, yeah, sorry. So because it's occurring so quickly, that human systems, ecological systems, cannot evolve that rapidly in any sort of stable form. So, adaptation, you could not adapt to that level of change and still hold a modularly organised, civilised, if we are civilised, but a modularly organised society. You couldn't live in the sort of reasonable levels of security that we have today, and that reasonable levels of sort of, I'm probably over-exaggerating, we're civilised, but civilised society that we have today, that we couldn't do that with 4 degrees centigrade of warming. That the ecosystems would not be able to adapt to that level of change. There'd be rapid shifts there, which would have massive implications for our human systems. And so all the parts that we require for living a reasonably stable, good existence would break down. That's not to say that all humans would die and all life would go off the planet. I mean, there's no suggestion, as far as I know, that would be the case. But it would be a devastatingly different world from where we are today, and it also wouldn't be stable. So you wouldn't be stopping at 4 degrees centigrade. It looks like if you head up to that sort of temperature that you're starting to kick in lots more feedbacks. So 4 degrees centigrade is a temperature threshold that you're passing through as you head towards some new stabilization at a much higher level. At every level, it is something we should be avoiding. And indeed, the Committee on Climate Change, who are deeply conservative in my view in most of these things, but they've often said this point that 4 degrees centigrade, we have to do everything we can to avoid it. I mean, they call it extreme climate change, and I think that's a fair description of it. So
it sounds like you would disagree with Bjorn Lomborg, who says the optimum level of warming is 3.75 degrees Celsius when you do the cost-benefit trade-offs.
Cost benefit. I mean, I know it's a bit like this. I've never looked at my stars. I've never looked at. I'm not interested whether I'm Sagittarius or Cancer, whatever it happens to be. I'm not interested in what they tell me, and I'm similarly not interested in what cost-benefit analysis tells me either, because they both have the same validity. I have no problem with cost.
It's your benefit and someone else's cost, so it's not.
Yeah, and is it really my benefit at a systems level? We just look at what happened in continental. If you look at continental Europe. Now, the Syrian issue, it's a political issue, all the other things were played into that, but I mean, the 12 years of drought in that area didn't help, it exacerbated the issues. But what we saw there was small, so I'm not claiming that's a climate change event. I mean, it wasn't helped by climate change, but it wasn't a climate change event. But nevertheless, what we saw there were small numbers of people coming from other parts of the world with a different culture into continental Europe. And I remember most of the people that left those parts of the world went to Lebanon and Jordan. They didn't come to continental Europe. And we always forget that in Europe. They came to continental Europe, and almost immediately we broke down some of the sort of central tenets of the European Union, things like the Schengen Agreement, so freedom of movement across borders. And suddenly lots more guards were coming out. I was going to Sweden getting stopped to be looking at my passport. And so what we saw there was actually when even probably one of the most stable sort of political institutions like the European Union, it almost overnight it starts to break down. The Hungarians are putting up razor wire to stop people moving, from other borders. So this is a small shift. As I say, most of the people went to Lebanon and other parts. This is a small shift in numbers of people coming across to continental Europe, and already you got sort of like the breakdown of many of the sort of the central tenets of the EU. Now, if you're seeing 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of warming, wherever Lomborg's living, unless it's on Mars or something, he will be living through the implications of these changes playing out around the world, and the repercussions of that as other parts of the world start to move, the military tension that it exacerbates, the changes in food patterns because of the breakdown of some of the insects that pollinate our crops. So I think it's a completely naive and simplistic view, and a deeply arrogant Western rich view of climate change. That Lomborg and others, I don't know if he still holds that view or not. As I say, I'm not.
Oh, he has a new book. He has a new book out on that. Yeah, anyway, let's not spend time talking about him.
No, not in my view. There are he holds his position on this, and I and lots of others hold completely different worldviews on this. And yes, it is important that we come together from time to time. But I think we tried. That has been tried for donkey's years, really, and I think we just have to hold those separate worldviews. I'm not sure there's much more that we can learn between each other, and the idea that 3.7 is I love this idea of optimal 3.7. Was it not 3.73? I mean, where do you get that level of precision? No, but I'm saying that level of precision out of a cost-benefit analysis at a global level over the next 100 years. I mean, it's spurious nonsense.
Well, of course it is. But let's move on. I've been hogging all your time, and this is great. I'm loving it. But there are a lot of other people want to ask you questions. But there's one subject I do have to get into with you, and that is, we noted it before, negative emissions technologies, also called carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal, and all of those things. I believe you have referred to it as a moral hazard. So first of all, can you just please tell us why you think this reliance or discussion, or what you mean by moral hazard when it comes to carbon dioxide removal?
Well, firstly, I've not said it's a moral hazard, and I think this is absolutely key. This is a small, nuanced distinction, which is huge. It is the reliance on these future technologies that is the moral hazard, not not the technologies themselves, even the concept of the technologies. That's not a moral hazard. I have no problem with that, and I regularly say in talks that I would like to see significant funding of negative emission technologies and some of the other carbon dioxide removal techniques, and deployment of them if they meet stringent sustainability and equity criteria. But to rely on those, rather than actually reducing our emissions today, that is the moral hazard. That is where we are passing the burden, the moral to the challenges, onto other generations, and indeed onto other, even with this one, onto other communities elsewhere in the world. So it's the reliance on these technologies being deployed at global scale. Let's not play out. Let's make have some clarity here. If you look at most of the scenarios that are informing governments on reducing emissions, and if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3, which, as an aside, I don't think should be in the IPCC Working Group 3, but that's because it's innately a political issue, so I don't think you can have an optimised view of what it should look like. But if you look at all the scenarios in the IPCC, virtually every single one of them, they're awash with some sort of way of removing huge quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the future, at a scale that is not that dissimilar to the size of the current oil and gas industry. So can you imagine if you had some scenarios of the future, and you say, there's a chance you might have this new industry we don't know anything about, and we're going to run several hundred models, and every single one, scenarios, and every single one is going to assume it will be there, the same size as the current oil and gas industry. No other model runs would you ever do, in any other realm of life would you ever do that. But the reason you do it is because it allows you to maintain the short, the sort of immediate to near term as politically palatable. So these negative emission technologies are played out at huge scale, planetary scale, in virtually every single scenario. And they weren't discussed for a long time. I mean, they were just sort of quiet in the background that allowed us to keep the foreground looking attractive. And now, thankfully, people are starting to talk about them. But let's be clear, I'm not opposed to people doing research on negative emissions. I'm not opposed to people doing research on other. I mean, I don't like the expressions nature-based solutions. It's an awful expression to me. But the sort of things that are captured in that, fine. Let's do the research on these things. Let's look at their sustainability. Let's not make the problems that we face worse by just pursuing sort of reckless reductionist approaches. Let's think about the system implications. Let's look at the equity implications, the land use implications. Let's look at all of those things. And if they do look like they're viable, let's deploy them. But let's not reduce our mitigation effort today on the reliance of those in the future. And that is happening already. That's why the scenarios allow us to...
So let me ask you something about that, because first of all, yes, totally agree. And as you know, I invested in carbon capture 10 years ago because I thought we're going to need it. And I'm pretty sure we are going to need it. And the good news is, actually, I think it'll work. So that's good. And I think you support that. But let's just... so what you're saying is we should not have, and we shouldn't now rely on carbon capture to reduce our mitigation efforts. Okay, I 100% agree with that. But now let's just say that the concept of carbon capture didn't exist. It never did. Don't you think we'd find some other excuse for not reducing our emissions by now?
Oh.
It was just an excuse. It didn't really stop us, or it isn't stopping us from reducing our emissions. It's just one of the things they just point to.
Well, yeah, I think it's much more complex than that, and emergent than that. I don't think it's simply, we've got a new route, we'll put that into our models. I just don't think. I mean, it's firstly it emerges over time because it's a cumulative problem. As you're running the models in the past, you had more carbon budget, if you like, left, more emissions you could put in the atmosphere, and so you didn't have to worry about some of these sorts of more exotic solutions to put in the models. But as we carried on failing to deal with climate change, the amount of emissions we can put in the atmosphere gets less and less, and eventually it gets to a point where you're going to have major political repercussions, and we think, well, we can't do that. And so you start to put in these other things in the models that hold the whole sort of pack of cards together. Remember, these aren't climate models. These are what are called integrated assessment models. They're models that have a sort of simple climate model bolted onto some sort of economics model, which is broadly a neoclassical growth model, a general equilibrium model, and on top of that, some sort of vague idea about the issues to do with transitions, how rapidly you can put in technologies and so forth. Principally, it ignores things like behaviour, ignores major political change, and you embed a 5% discount rate in it. So it's a sort of standard model. It's
right.
the wrong tool for the job, but everyone uses them. So these models use these things, and because these models have got to maintain a sort of some sort of growth model in the core of them, then as the budgets got smaller and smaller, so we had to add things like negative emissions in there, so they got larger and larger in the models as time progressed, and we didn't do anything about climate change. And so I'm not opposed to us considering those things, but I think it'd be unreasonable to say that they were just put in as a ruse and we would have found something else. I think it has coloured the debate. So if in fact for the last, say, 5 to 10 years we've been talking about much more rapid rates of mitigation or much higher temperatures if we're going to fail, then I think we would have that debate would have changed, and where we are now, we would have probably been 5 years earlier, which would have given us 5 more years of leeway. But because principally in the academic community, and partly within some of the NGOs who weren't prepared to talk about these things, we kept playing a cheery tale from our models.
Right.
So why would people be quite so concerned? And so I don't agree with the fact it's just there and we would have found some other excuse. We would have found other excuses, and we'll still continue to find other excuses. But
right.
it has had a fundamental and profound impact, I think, on the arguments that we have had and continue to have. And this is why I think it's interesting that the civil society movements have not fallen into the easy trap of, don't worry, we've got this scam called, huge planetary scale negative emissions, and we're going to rely on those. Now, I'm not saying the techs are a scam, but the assumption that they will work is a scam, because we don't know if they will or not. It's just a hope.
By the way, I can tell you, we need to have a whole separate hour on this, but they do work, and I think
and not at scale. No, they don't work at scale.
No. The reason they're not at scale. Well, it doesn't mean they won't work at scale, but the reason they're not at scale is that there's absolutely no reason to build them. There is no incentive to pay. No one will pay you to save the world. So we should not be surprised that they're not being scaled. There's no one will pay to do it. So.
And I think we're agreeing on that. I mean, I'm not, as I'm saying, I think we should be looking to research them and deploy them when they meet other sustainability criteria. But we haven't done that, so we do not know. I think it's as accurate to say we have some of the technologies. We know they work in pilot phase. We don't know they can absorb hundreds of billions of CO2, which is what's assumed in the models. Remember, hundreds of billions of CO2, tons of CO2.
Tons.
What we're talking about is a few thousand tons here, a few million tons there. That's what we're talking about so far. So there's no way that you should just automatically assume they will work at scale in the time frame, and that's the bit we haven't spoken about at all, in the time frame that we have to maintain the temperatures at the sort of levels that we think are appropriate. And so going back to your point early on about 1.5 and 2, the questions around that, I think we can mitigate for 2. It's massively challenging and huge shifts in many of our value systems around the world with mitigation. I think we can reduce our emissions in line with 2 degrees centigrade if we're lucky on climate sensitivity. We've got to be pretty lucky on that. So if we're lucky on that, we can hold to 2. I don't think we can hold to 1.5. But if you want to stay at 1.5, or indeed 1, then if you do everything you can on mitigation for 2, and we are lucky or successful with negative emissions, that might get us to 1.5. But it does require us. So in a sense, that's another argument about this radical shift. We need radical, profound change to reduce our emissions to get anywhere near 2 degrees centigrade. And if we want to go to 1.5, we've got to also get these other techniques to work. Because in isolation, I don't know. I'd like to be proved wrong about this. I don't know how you can get to a good chance of 1.5 without some sort of way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Because I don't think you can mitigate for it. But I'm happy to be proved wrong. But given, as I said before, if you drew a straight line from today, it would be 2029 is when you'd go through the carbon budget in the IPCC for 1.5. A good chance of 1.5.
Well, I got a million more questions on that, but I do want to get to other people. So I'm going to ask you one last question. I have a whole list here, but I'm going to ask you one last question broadly. In all the climate models that say we can hit 1.5 and 2 and stuff like that, they all make certain assumptions about Earth system feedbacks. And some of those feedbacks might be conservative or whatever. And then they're probably missing some. And so in your mind, what are sort of the feedbacks that you think might not be properly accounted for? And just off the top of my head, there's permafrost. One recent one I heard is that at 2 degrees warming, soils will emit 230 gigatons of carbon, not CO2 carbon, which is a big number. Amazon dieback, these kinds of things. So what's included, what's not, and how what should we be concerned about?
Well, firstly, I think the science has dealt with these issues as best that it can. So working group one of the IPCC, basically the scientists have gone out and done what scientists do. And they've looked at the feedbacks. It's not as if they aren't aware of most of the feedbacks. We probably are aware of most of the feedbacks. What we can't do is quantify them robustly. So within the climate models, and they say these are very distinct from these sort of energy models and integrated assessment models. From the pure climate models, which is just basically lots of physics and a big handle that you grind and some answers come. So the big climate models, in those, they've looked at the feedbacks, and the ones that are sufficiently well understood and can be quantified, they've included in the models. And that's perfectly, that's the right thing to do. But if you've got other feedbacks that you know are there, but you don't really have much of a handle on the quantification of them, they're a much messier thing that we're still learning about, then they're typically not put in the models. Sometimes they run as like an aside, and you can sort of bolt them onto the model to sort of do a test. Well, what happens if this and what happens if that? And then other ones are so much more uncertain, there's not even much point doing that. Overall, the people who work on what's called Earth system models, so these are climate models that try to capture more of these feedbacks. Typically, they're expecting to see the total amount of CO2 that we can emit going down, because these additional feedbacks will likely make the budget smaller. So from any precautionary approach, you would of course then say the budget's going to be a lot smaller. That would seem reasonable to me from a precautionary approach. But that's not the job of the scientists to do that. It's the job of the people who use the science to do that. But it does require those of us who use the science to stop and spend a little bit of time thinking about what's in the science, how science is done, and reflecting on how we should use the science to inform our decision-making process on things like policy and so forth. So we have to be discerning users of the science. I don't think the science should be just trying to provide convenient numbers for us as people who use it. It has to do what it can best do. It's done that in terms of the feedback. So I don't really want to be particularly critical of the climate community, the climate science community. There's ongoing debates there about the impact of the different feedbacks. Some of the ones you mentioned, permafrost or and additional methane or clouds, are incredibly complicated things. So there's ongoing debates within the climate science community about how these things play out, what is the physics behind it, and how do you include them in the models. But that is incumbent on the rest of us then to think about, well, okay, what do we think about these other feedbacks? Will they overall make the situation worse or better? And there's quite an interesting article in Carbon Brief, I think it was last year, about a year ago, that pulls together some of these Earth system model outputs, and it suggests that it's likely to be much worse. In other words, we have a much smaller carbon budget. So I think that but then it's incumbent on those of us who are thinking about, well, what do we do about this? To I would argue, take a precautionary approach in thinking about responding to climate change. But again, the precautionary approach is nothing to do with science. It's something that it's a valued decision as whether you think that's an appropriate way of dealing with things. If you're a gambler and prepared to take high risks, you probably wouldn't take a precautionary approach. You'd just take the risks. Maybe that's where Lomberg lives. Maybe it's better on those things. Others of us might think, actually, in such situations with such dire repercussions, I'd rather be much more precautionary.
Yeah, I think that most people, if they were told that you can put your child on this airplane and there's a 2/3 chance it will arrive safely at its destination, I think no one would put their child on that airplane. But of course, we're all doing that right now.
Yeah.
So I've asked you. I thank you so much. I've taken way more time than I'm supposed to for this, but hopefully you're going to stick around for a little while so we can get to the audience question.
This concludes the end of part 1 of the interview with Kevin Anderson. The second part, which is about an hour and a half, includes discussion based on questions from the audience. Thank you very much for listening to part 1.